What's the difference between a web page and a web app? We'll discuss this question today, and with me is Mike Amundsen, author of many books in the web space. Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. It's good to see you again and talk about this topic.
If you had to explain to somebody what's really an essential part of that difference, how would you explain what a web page is? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, to me, a web page has a couple of key parts to it. Obviously, it has the server, the web server. The web server is serving up some kind of code. Typically, that web server is connected to a database. So there's some information about the number of users, or the number of documents or products or whatever that is. And that web server puts together there's some app code that runs on it that puts together some web page that's got HTML and sends it to the browser. Then the browser renders that HTML, and it could be lists and tables and possibly forms and search buttons and so on and so forth. A web page is literally a page sent by a server that maybe contains some data from some data store that's rendered by a browser.
And I would say that is our traditional web experience, right? You go to a web page and you get back that HTML that is rendered, and you look at it, and then you do some next step. And that's different from a web app. So if we look at a web app is more dynamic. So the main difference there is that a web app contains scripting code, and the overall logic there is just a little different. So what in case of a web app happens, technically you could also say it's a web page, but it's a page that contains scripting, and that's an important difference. So you go to a web app, your browser loads the web app, which is a mix of HTML and scripting code. And now the scripting code is executed in the browser, and the scripting code has the ability to pull in additional information through an API that is on the server. And in that case, what the scripting code can do is can refresh the web page or parts of the web page without having to refresh the whole web page. And this is, I would say, the typical difference that we see many times, that it just feels a little different from the old I'm navigating from page to page experience. And I think that's one of the interesting things to discuss here, not just like this technical difference, but also what does it mean for a user? So if you had to explain to somebody what is the difference for the user between a web page and a web app, how would you explain that difference, Mike?
Yeah, I think the classic example is really just what you said. So typically with a web page, an HTML page, we navigate from page to page to page, and there's sort of this refresh experience, a sort of rewrite experience. Let me go get the page, let me go render the page and show it to you and wait for you to click on something. Whereas the web app is a much more seamless experience, a much richer experience. You can mouse over something and it automatically goes and gets more data, or you can do searches or filters and so on and so forth, and you don't get that constant refresh or that feel like you're going from page to page to page. You feel like you're sort of in an app. You feel like you're in an application that has all of the functionality built right into it, I think.
I think that's probably the most important point. Like you said, if I as a user use the web app, it'll be more responsive, because it will react to my interactions apart from just me navigating to a new page. What I think is also an important difference or adds to this experience is that things can also be triggered from the server side, right? So even without me doing anything, a web app could start doing stuff because something has happened. There's an update, there's a new post, there's a new comment, right? And that's another thing that typically on web pages, I would say you're kind of missing, that where they're just sitting there and nothing changes. And for a web app, right, you can make that much more dynamic, because you can also, through the scripting, right, if you build it right, you can also have things being triggered by events that happen on the server side.
That's a really good point. That idea of refreshing, having that sort of auto refresh, is another real key element to a rich experience for the user.
These things come as a cost, so there is something you need to do differently, and that's another topic that we should discuss briefly. So we talked about what the difference for the user is, and it seems like, well, it's maybe nicer for the user if it's done well. But how is it different for the developer? So is it something that is much harder to build, or what would you say is the main thing for the developer of these pages or apps where those two approaches differ?
Yeah, well, I will focus on this notion that now you have an API. You have to design this API. We used to focus on just designing the pages for an app. Now you have to focus on designing the API itself, sort of independent of the client application. So you've got a lot more work ahead of you. And that API design can be intuitive or not so intuitive. So you've got to put a lot of extra effort in, I think. It's almost like leveling up. And it's not just enough to have a web server and a page. Now it's a web server and an app and a designed API as well. So there's more involved in those steps. That's the first thing I think of.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the end, what you're doing is you're designing a distributed application, because parts are running in the browser and parts are running on the server, right? And you have to think about what happens when that API maybe isn't reachable, right? Does my web app just hang, or does it behave reasonably?
Right.
So yes, this becomes more tricky. And the other thing that I would also like to add to this is to say, if you build just a web-based app which emits these web pages like you described in the beginning, you can do that in any programming language you'd like, right? A lot of people may use languages like PHP or ASP, but you can do anything and just put a web server in front of it, and that is what a lot of web-based applications look like. They have a web server, and then they forward the requests to an app, and that app is written in whatever language you like. For a web app, that's different, because the browser is executing code, and there you don't have a choice. You need to send JavaScript code to the browser, because that's the code that the JavaScript browser expects. So I think that's also a little bit of a difference here, that in particular, if you have existing code, then you may have in front of you this need to migrate some of this code or to rewrite it in JavaScript, because otherwise the browser won't be able to execute it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So that changes the developer experience. I think it can be a more rewarding, but it's also a more challenging developer experience to build one of these web apps.
Yeah, you have more. I think you just have more constraints to deal with. But you're also, and that's the last thing that we want to discuss, you also have some opportunities along the way. So you were already talking about this API and that it should be designed. And frankly, in some web apps, it's not very well designed. You know, it's kind of like almost like a side effect of the whole thing. And in that case, those APIs oftentimes are really very specifically just for that web app. But there's an opportunity there that if you do, like you said, design this API in a well kind of conceived way, it becomes reusable. It becomes this thing that exists in itself. Now, why could that be useful?
Yeah, so this touches on the notion of now this API could could be connected to by something other than a web-based client, like maybe a phone, an iPhone or an Android phone client, or some other kind of desktop code. So the API now can be used by lots of other parties, not just sort of your initial need, which was getting that first app going, but by somebody else. So now you can start to make that app portion, that functionality, available to lots of other client applications.
Okay, great. I think that is all that we have to do to cover this topic. We didn't go very deep, but I think it's a good walkthrough what matters technically for the user, for the developer, and kind of architecturally, you might say. So thanks a lot, Mike, for joining us.
You bet.
And thanks everybody for watching. If you found this useful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And until next time, see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.